Yes, I
All
think
right,
so.
I see a thumbs up. All right, so give me one more moment. Let's then officially call this house to order. So before we begin, I would like to first congratulate both teams for making it this far into the tournament. Let's welcome there's LUMS1 in affirmative and Monash Australia 2 in negative. Before we begin, allow us the panel to introduce ourselves. I will be your chair. My name is Nicholas. I'm from the Ateneo Debate Society. May I ask my panelists to introduce themselves as well, starting with Leah.
Hi, my name is Leah.
And now Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa.
All right. So, without further ado, debating on the motion that Disney should remove from circulation cartoons from its history that contain racist caricatures, calling on now the first affirmative to begin. Whenever they are ready. Here.
Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yeah, loud and clear.
All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Disney are an incredibly powerful organizations whose movies are incredibly pervasive in modern life, including ones that were made 50, 60 years ago. That's particularly an issue because lots of these movies have content that does not stand the test of time. We don't think that it's right for Disney to continue to profit off of these horrible movies. And in particular, we think that they have horrible harms for society in general and racial relations. Let's understand firstly that Disney is incredibly rich, incredibly powerful, and with the advent of Disney Plus alongside their huge network of distribution, their movies are incredibly watched. More importantly, they often take on the form of cult classics in, for example, Dumbo, in, for example, all these different movies like Aladdin, etc., that are incredibly popular. We think that we think that the fact that these movies have incredibly glaring content and horribly racist content like blackface, like horrible stereotypes are incredibly problematic. We think that they belong in a museum whereby, for example, their art can be preserved for historical purposes, and they could be accompanied with the history and the context of these movies with, for example, commentaries on section by section, which explain why they're racist and why they're so bad. We think that it's important for Disney to atone for its sins and issue, for example, things like apologies and donate to things like Black Lives Matter. But at the very least, we think that it's important for them to stop actively damaging society and stop benefiting off of that damage. Having said that, let's understand why this sort of content is problematic, even with, for example, things like disclaimers. Right now, Disney is issuing this content on Disney Plus with disclaimers. Let's understand why those aren't sufficient. We think they're not sufficient, firstly, because they're often very short, especially in relation to the entirety of the movie. We think it's very hard to educate people on why certain content is racist simply through disclaimers. Number two, we think it's often very hard to control how these disclaimers are made, particularly because of their huge circulation that includes lots and lots of different channels, lots and lots of different places across the world. We think it's hard for them to control how lots of this content is presented, what kind of disclaimers are given with it. Thirdly, we think that the nature of their audience is also important in that these are kids who are very hard to, who aren't, for example, very serious people. They're often, for example, not going to take these things sort of seriously. They're very uneducated about racial relations as a whole, and thus they need to be sort of presented with far more context than these sorts of disclaimers can give. Importantly, let's understand a few important impacts of this. Number one, it takes away it's important to understand that these kids have limited time in that I can't watch movies all day. I can't watch shows all day. There's an opportunity cost to watching these shows. There's an opportunity cost in that if I watch this show with racist stereotypes, it actively takes away time from, for example, watching a more modern, progressive show that has a more diverse cast, that has more realistic, more positive sort of depictions of minorities. In that, newer shows are less likely to have these sorts of glaring stereotypes. They're more likely to have diverse content. They're more likely to have better messages to send these kids. So there's an active opportunity cost there. Now, what are the problems with these sorts of content in a whole? We think, number one, we think that the kind of socialization that they do to these kids is particularly problematic. In the, for example, explicit messages that they give, but also the more subliminal ones. Children are incredibly impressionable, and what these movies teach them is that racial characteristics or certain racial characteristics, particularly of minorities who are already incredibly vulnerable, are funny, are absurd, are inhuman often. So often, for example, they'll be presented in very otherized fashions where they actively stick out from the others. So that means that these sorts of kids are likely to internalize lots of these messages. They're likely to be especially because they're very impressionable. This is likely to result in real world problems, like these kids, for example, noticing the racial characteristics of their minority friends, of their minorities class fellows, and actively pointing them out. People with similar racial characteristics, including Black people, including Asian people, are likely to then be visibly and verbally bullied within schools and within, for example, neighborhoods for this. It's likely to increase racial polarization, especially because lots of these features now become very, very pointed out, very, very obvious to these kids. This is problematic because it means that we're more likely to see more minority bullying. But we also think that there's a problem with minorities witnessing lots of this content. We think that for example, in the context of Black Lives Matter, where you have lots of emotional sentiments attached to sorts of racial issues, where there's a microscope on lots of these issues, and you're very likely to notice many of these different things. We think that it's important because when they see racial characteristics similar to their own, coming from coming from many of the movies that they're watching, coming from cult classics with the stature of Disney that are often very iconic, we think that they're likely to internalize many of these things, and it's likely to be incredibly traumatic for their self-esteem, for their emotional well-being, and largely speaking, for their psychological well-being. Couple this with, for example, the bullying, and couple this with the social environment that they're likely to be raised in because of the popularity of these movies, as likely to be very, very traumatic for them. Having said that, let's understand an important principle as well here. Let's understand that what Disney is doing right now is that it's benefiting off of art that is racially problematic. We think this is an important moral issue within this debate. In that, let's understand that this content isn't going out for free. You're paying a subscription to Disney Plus. You're paying for example, the cost of the CDs or DVDs or on-demand sort of procuring this sort of stuff on demand. This money is likely to go to the families or directly to the people who made this content in the form of royalties, or even if they aren't, then they're likely to go to Disney, which is still problematic. We think that this means that people who made bad, dangerous, and very racist content that is leading to discrimination that we see today and have historically seen. We think that those sorts of people are profiting off of bad, harmful, racist content with no repercussions. We think this is problematic for a few key reasons. Number one, we think that what we're doing is that we're actively taking money from artists for their racist work. But number two, let's also understand that the kind of harm that they've done is not simply just racial, like it's not simply just saying something racist. It's they've actively been used, or these sorts of movies have been instruments of oppression for minorities. In that, for example, they've portrayed minorities as monkeys, they've used blackface, and there's a reason why lots of this content is particularly harmful, in that it dehumanizes them and has been active in the instruments of oppression to otherize them and be racist as a whole. It's kept these people in place. It's exactly why we, for example, don't use the N-word or the B-word or all of these sorts of things within society. And it's important because there's a need for retribution. There's a need for retribution for lots of this injustice. In our world, at the very least, we're making sure that they can no longer benefit off of this content. This is particularly problematic because all of this sorts of racial characterization is done without the consent or the input of the minorities that they represent. In that, we think that lots of minorities have been betrayed. Lots of minorities have not had input in the kinds of portrayals that have been done of them, and they've not benefited off of any of these sorts of portrayals, whether it's through monetary benefit, whether it's through social benefit, etc., etc. For all of those reasons, because we believe that this is incredibly harmful work, and because we should no longer benefit off of it, we urge you to vote Gov.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for this speech. To begin the substantive for the negative bench, now calling the very honorable first negative speaker to begin whenever they are ready. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Cool. Just give me a second, yeah?
Yeah, no problem.
This debate isn't just centered around the current kids who are just watching the show. This debate is also for people like you and me, Chair. where we grew up watching these shows, not knowing the messages that were implicitly behind, thinking that these shows were funny, that these shows were great, and they were the perfect way to end your night. But the horrible reality is now when you and I both watch these shows, we realize the racism that was implicitly there, that we thought was perfectly fine. But now we self-check ourselves because for far too long, we've consumed media that we thought was okay, but in reality was not. Two issues of rebuttal before I move on into substantives that would be clashes. Number one, on this idea of opportunity cost, right? Like they didn't tell you why opportunity cost was so important and that why at a point in which a kid watches this cult classic, he can't watch any other show. Two responses. Number one, kids have a fuck ton of time to watch shows, right? That's all they literally do every day. Number two, your cult classics are a minority of the number of shows that they watch, right? The comparative is this. Your new generation movies like Moana looks better in terms of animation, is more likely going to attract your kid, is marketed better as well, because obviously it's the new in thing and it's going to be marketed more. That means on the comparative, if you put these two shows on the platform for a kid to choose, he's always going to choose the new generation show because it's more attractive to him. But a second piece of rebuttal, right? This last ditch principle that was not well made. Disney being racist and profiting off the shows is horribly bad. We tell you there are plenty of shows that are racist and horrible and depicts it purposely so that it encourages a form of discourse, right? Like Django Unchained has to be the most horrific racist show that you can see. Slaves being whipped, but we still show it and we still allow Quentin Tarantino to profit off the show because of the valuable discourse material that Django Unchained has brought into society. When white individuals can actually see how slaves were treated, we say it was perfectly fine for Quentin Tarantino to profit off this because he brought the reality back to society to show the world what this looks like. But the big question we need to answer is who is watching these shows? And this is what my speech will deal with, right? We think side of AF was very soft at the point in which they say, yeah, there is benefits to watching this show. That's why they want to keep it in museums. No, there is a benefit in their world to keep these shows and they want to put it in museums for discourse. So if that is true, we tell you we should make that discourse as accessible as possible for all individuals, right? So this is what we would prefer in our world. Number one, we'll slap labels in front of these shows. Show it's not good enough, but we will allow these shows for schools to show them during literature time or for history classes where teachers can just go onto Disney and pull out the show and go to the exact scene where it's racist and teach his kids, right? But let's move on into my first group of individuals that side F clearly ignored. Adults who grew up with these shows, right? So now we watch this show, not with the intention of trying to critique the show, but it's usually about going down memory lane, right? I don't know when was the last time I brought up Dumbo, but the point in which I watched Dumbo, I think about myself as a kid watching Dumbo. Until the point a racist scene comes and me as an adult now can absorb that scene and can understand that scene was wrong, the average Joe is more likely going to check themselves and tell you that racism was prevalent. Because at the end of the day, we fundamentally forget how prevalent racism was and therefore forget the extent racism is even until today. What does this look like for the average white individual, right? Like you forget that you were a part of a culture that had strongly stereotyped and embraced these shows that like literally painted minorities in a bad light, right? You think you're not racist just because you voted for Obama. But the point in which you watch your favorite cartoon show at the age of 21 and realize that, yeah, it is true. The discourse going around Dumbo's black scarecrows were actually really bad is the point in which you induce a form of self-reflection, right? You think about your actions. You think about all the media that you've consumed your whole life and whether or not there were actually biases in those media that you actually consume. You start to question yourself that your whole life of 20 years, whatever have you received, you are more likely going to challenge it because you now can see, A, that the show still exists, but number two, we give you the context that, look, racism was prevalent, we shouldn't forget it, you should understand that is likely to exist today. What is the impact of this, right? And note this is a benefit that is mutually exclusive to our side at a point in which we re-trigger your old memories and tell you that, look, your good memories were somewhat racist. You're more likely to be sympathetic to causes like the Black Lives Matter and to show support for minorities because you realize that, hey, I was complicit as well. My whole life, I've watched a show that was actually implicitly racist and I enjoyed it instead of calling it out and learning from it. That is the cognitive shift individuals have, and you cannot undervalue that cognitive shift because people like you and me actually went through that when we rewatch these old Disney shows, right? But on to the second group of individuals who watch these shows, children. like concede from F that there is benefits in putting it in the museum, we think that means there's an active incentive for you to teach your kids that these shows exist and why you need to have some soft discussions like that. We see a trend like this, such as slavery and Holocaust, while being such a very heavy and like gory topic to talk about, we still introduce this to year 4s and year 5s, but on a fundamental level to tell you that during World War II, the Jews were persecuted, they were killed. We don't show you these gore images, but we give you a fundamental base in which you learn and you now understand that persecution exists. This is the same way we can have discussions about history at a point in which your English teacher can pull out Dumbo or Lady in the Tramp and show it to the class and say, right here, this scene, as much as we are painting it in the right picture in the movie, this was fundamentally wrong. At the point in which your teacher can call out that the scene was fundamentally wrong, you have some sort of discussion over the context in which society lives at that point. You now educate the kid and say, this seemed perfectly fine because society thought it was perfectly fine. We think that distinction needs to be taught to kids and will be done so much better if we make it so accessible that everyone can learn from it as a whole, right? But on the even if, let's just say your child, for some reason, is going to stumble upon this show, and at the point he watches it, F says there are a lot of harms. We think that even if a child with no guidance, no parent, no teacher sitting with him watching the show, we don't think it is that harmful. Number one, the child lacks the racism context, right? Like a lot of this are implicit and are not necessarily explicit. But even if it is explicit, it is the rare off chance that we're talking about this. It's more of the implicit biasness that happens, right? Like blackface is outdated. Like young kids growing up today don't see blackface as often because we've actually removed it from our society, right? That means your child has never been exposed to these contexts, and your child will never be able to link these stereotypes to the kind of harms that it is, right? That is what we tell you. But even if at the point F wants to tell you that your child will watch this show and will take away a racist message, this is where we say you have to weigh this, right? Like kids watch a diverse amount of shows. And we told you from my first rebuttal itself, they are more likely going to watch your new shows. So if your kid has a bunch of new animated, better looking shows that have a diverse cast, that have the right messaging values, you watch 10 of those shows, the comparative is your one cult, classic cult with bad messaging will never outweigh the benefits of the 10 shows that you get. What's even better is your cult classics are finite, meaning to say they've been made and have not been produced again, but your new generation diverse show keeps increasing, right? You got Frozen 1, Frozen 2, Moana 2 is coming out. So the point to this is that even if your child watches this show and this gets a wholly racist message, it is generally outweighed from all the new diverse movies that your child watches. For all those reasons, let's keep Dumbo so we can learn and not be Dumbo. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their speech. To extend the substantive of the affirmative bench, now calling the very honorable second affirmative speaker to begin whenever they're ready. You're here.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. You're loud and clear.
And it's really funny because if I look at op case, it sounds like all of the people who are white trying to argue for conservative statues or statues from the Confederacy still being allowed to be put up in America, because all of the arguments are the same. We want discourse, museums don't work, all of those sorts of things. And I just think that that's complete lies. And I'm going to approach this speech in a couple of ways. One, I'm going to talk about developing countries because, you know, Disney isn't limited to the white world where all of this sorts of civil advocacy exists. Two, I'm going to talk about this idea of opportunity cost and how kids are affected on our side of the house. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about this new material about, you know, adults really need to change the way they think, and the best way to do it is Disney movies. Let's talk about developing countries first, because that's the positive material and I really need to get through this. I think the thing that we need to recognize is that Disney has a global market, right? And lots of these sorts of shows are dubbed in local languages. So for instance, Urdu or Hindi or any other sort of language that you have in a local context. And then they're also English dubbed. So these are widely popular shows. But why are these kinds of cult classics the ones that are usually more popular in developing countries as compared to Frozen 1 or Frozen 2 or Frozen 3? I would argue that they are immensely popular because one, there's very little competition within these markets, right? In the sense that local animation industries are quite bad and they don't actually make it to TV. So you actually have to watch whatever's come up on the Disney Channel or any other channel which is showing Disney. But the second thing that I would point out is they actually have a big bigger cult status in developing countries because there was no other option for their parents, etc., to watch. Back in the day, their parents actually talk about this. They say, yeah, this is fantastic, watch it, all of that sort of stuff. But lastly, I would also argue that local distributors find it cheaper to distribute these kinds of films as opposed to the newer ones, because the newer ones demand higher sorts of royalties, higher sorts of payments, because again, like they're newer, there was a higher cost to making them, and these are much more cheaper to show to kids and actually make a profit off of. So this is why these sorts of films are extremely important within these contexts. Now, why is this? One, I think parents don't generally have the time to see whatever their kids are doing all the time. Why? Because they have jobs, right? There are sometimes multiple kids that you need to take care of. There are completely like lots of home duties that you have, chores that you need to do, cleaning, etc., all of those sorts of things, which mean that you don't ever have parental advisory. Like parental advisory is like not happening all the time. I think a simple intuitive pump is just imagine the number of teen boys watching porn all the time. Like if their parents actually had the capacity to do this and control this, they wouldn't be doing that, right? I think the second thing that they also problematically for the parents is the parents don't have the lived experience of racism like parents in the United States or in European societies. Like white parents, even within the United States of America, would be really wary about giving this sort of content if they knew that it was racist and read the disclaimer, because they've actually seen racism, right? They've actually been party to conversations around racism in their workplaces, in their schools, in BLM protests, on the news. This sort of stuff doesn't happen in these sorts of countries, quite specifically because Black people don't exist in Pakistan to the same degree, like they don't exist in Pakistan and lots of these sorts of countries. But lastly, I would also argue that this is worse in our model because like civil advocacy doesn't exist here. BLM does not exist here. Nobody exists here to criticize these shows as racist, etc. And notice, Mani told you that Disney does not have control over how these shows are shown over here. So while Disney can do disclaimers on Disney Plus, Disney does not get to decide what a local Pakistani TV channel, which has bought rights to a movie, shows in that movie, right? And they also don't get to decide whether kids actually listen to this because again, like disclaimers are not really read. Why is this a massive problem on our side of the house? I want to lots of racism exists within immigrant communities. So if you go into the United States of America or you go into the UK, Pakistani, Muslim or South Asian diasporas are extremely racist, extremely anti-Black. The greatest example of this was also like an Arab calling for George Floyd to be arrested during these campuses. So like immigrants are also extremely racist because they've been shown these shows and also crucially don't have access to the other kind of language or progressive stuff that white people get in the US and UK. So I think there's a lot of racism that ingrains there. But let's assume that they don't get to immigrate, right? What if they stay back? I think one, there are lots of dark-skinned people within these own countries. So fairness screams, for instance, are extremely popular within these sorts of contexts. Why? Because lots of people are bullied. At the point at which they see somebody dark in school and they associate them with a character who had big lips or had a face like a monkey, which is actually shown in these sorts of movies, they become the butt of jokes. Apart from just the simple bullying, the kind of mental torture it enforces on lots of these sorts of kids to go through all of these sorts of procedures is just actually much more harmful. And lastly, it's also about how these kids feel about themselves, right? At the point at which I am a dark-skinned individual watching this sort of portrayal or dark-skinned people, it's very difficult for me to understand be happy about myself or feel represented because essentially what these shows have done have otherized me. I think this is crucially not something that happens on our side of the house because quite specifically, Disney removes any access, we close the vault and don't enable this sort of content to be removed. Now, let's move on to a couple of rebuttals. Why is the opportunity cost argument important? Because one, the messages that you give kids are better, and two, people who are actually involved in the filmmaking, like Black actors, Black directors, all of those sorts of people get to profit. But also, if you make a progressive show or like Frozen 2 or Frozen 3, whatever, much more profitable, then you can open up future opportunities for these actors as well, right? Because they become profitable people in the market. You really need them because of their success. Now, what is their rebuttal to this? One, they say kids have lots of time to watch shows, and therefore, this is not an argument. I would posit that if kids have lots of time to watch these shows, then their argument about why kids only watch Frozen, etc., doesn't work. That also means kids have lots of time to watch all of these sorts of racist shows on Disney Plus as well, especially because Disney Plus doesn't have billions of shows. Like, okay, they might have movies like 50, 60. Like, if you have lots of time, you're going to finish all of those in a month, especially if you're in quarantine. I think that is a huge harm on their side of the house. But secondly, I would posit that, like, realistically, time is limited. You have to go to school, you have to sleep early. So there is a limited period of time for you you to do this. So insofar as that is true, we actually get more viewership. Then they say, they don't prove why kids don't watch these shows, right? Apart from cult classics. Like, yes, there is a big reason for why these shows are important. Like Mickey Mouse, for instance, lots of these sorts of shows have built up literal fucking histories. They are shown on TV. They are shown on, like, parents sort of recollect this sort of nostalgia in front of kids. So all of this sort of stuff happens in under their world. Why is this problematic? Because all of the arguments about like bullying, etc., come back in this debate, and that is a huge thing. Then what is their response? Like, their response is, children have the capacity to decide. They watch 10 progressive films, they watch one racist film, and then they're not racist. Like, guys, kids are not adults, but also, like, even if they're exposed to one, it makes it much more likelier for them to bully someone, right? At the point at which they watch only 10 progressive ones and not the one, it is still a benefit on our side of the house. Then they say, we can show these sorts of things in school and really educate kids. Like, I'm not sure why, one, this is the only avenue for you to educate kids, right? There have been lots of avenues created to educate kids about like Black history and enslavement and all of those sorts of things. And arguably much more easily understandable, right? If you tell kids that slavery was wrong, it is easier for them to understand why slavery was wrong as opposed to telling them this specific depiction of them as this is wrong. Like, I think the nuances to understand that are extremely difficult. But even if you want kids to understand, there's a school, there's a museum which has this movie or has huge descriptions of this movie on our side of the house. You can literally push the kids there, take them on a school trip, and give them this sort of access to history. I'm not sure why schools around the world should be showing this. Lastly, about this accessibility and like this idea of like, you know, adults and average white, I want to push back on this. One, some people might want to go back through nostalgia, but lots of people don't actually watch these movies because one, there are lots of other adult movies that we watch, but two, like there's embarrassment in terms of watching kids movies. If you just talk to your friends about, oh, I watched this movie or cartoon back in the day, like I think there's lots of embarrassment attached to that, which is why problematically, like adults who also have jobs, by the way, don't watch these kinds of films. So I think one, they don't challenge biases through the mechanisms they give. But I think crucially, adults have other avenues to challenge these biases. So in their workplace, presumably they encounter Black people. When they're watching the news, they presumably see BLM protests come up on the news, right? When they're any, like in voting, for instance, it becomes a huge issue. I am not sure why this is a crucial mechanism for adults who want to change how they behave. For all these reasons, for the fact that we want to stop bullying, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their speech. To extend the substantive of the negative bench, now calling the very honorable second negative speaker to begin. Whenever they're ready. Here, here. Your microphone is still muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you loud and clear.
To understand this debate, you need to understand who is watching Dumbo in 2020. And our conception is the majority of people who is watching Dumbo are not the children who have thousands of better shows they'd rather watch, thousands of more contemporary shows they're more interested in, but the adults with nostalgia. And these are the people therefore most affected by this debate. Before we get on to discussing then the crux of this debate, we'll first discuss some random rebuttals that couldn't fit into first areas. First thing we'd like to say is we don't believe that Disney shows reinforce or cause racism in the way that they would like to say it would. Because all they say about bullying is they say that if you watch these shows and you see, say, for example, a crow that is Black and behaves in like a certain Black stereotypes, you might then therefore use crow jokes against your Black friends. First, we say to the extent that a place is already racist, or removing or not having these shows is no difference, right? Because if you're already going to make jokes about like the Black kid in your class, or you're already going to make jokes as like because you live in certain nations that were more racist, you are going to make those jokes regardless. It's not like that you couldn't find different animals to compare to just because Disney no longer provides you certain caricatures for you to draw on, to which we say that you've decreased any amount of the actual bullying created in places that were already racist. But second, we tell you that Disney does not reinforce racism in the way that like other shows might. Because the way that Disney does caricatures is they do things like minstrel crow shows. They're not explicitly saying, look, Black people do these sorts of things, right? They're just saying, here are some crows and they behave in a way that is stereotypically what was associated with minstrel shows. And that therefore is like, from our perspective, a very problematic thing. Or they show you a cat, which has like really acts and behaves like a really racist Asian stereotype, but the cat is never told. Like we never get to point at the cat and say, this is how Asians behave, laugh at them. Instead, therefore, in order for you to become racist from watching a Disney show, you have to first must already understand the racist viewpoints that they're coming from, and then buy into it and not have any mechanism of protection against believing that these minstrel shows should be wrong. Which is why we told you that particularly children, who are often very young and have no concept of what a minstrel show even is, for who the Chinese stereotypes that cat is trying to portray is so different that they may as well come from a different culture, all they would see is a cat that's behaving in a bit of a funny way with some slanted eyes. They wouldn't understand that that's meant to be a mockery of Asian people, because no one would have told them yet that it's a mockery of Asian people. Therefore, they don't increase the level of racism that they experience. But to the extent that they want, just on another extraneous point of rubble, to the extent that they say that some of these areas can't have logos slapped on front of them and Disney can't control the distribution, well, then that just means that area is out of this debate, because to the extent that Disney can't control the distribution, they also can't stop that circulation. So therefore, if you want to talk about developing nations where apparently Disney can never put a logo in front of it, we would say that, like, therefore developing nations are not part of this debate, given that most of their movies seem to come from, like, apparently really archaic deals that Disney has no control over. So therefore, let's move on. Okay, who is watching this? And why is it therefore more important that we impact adults? First, understand why we believe adults fundamentally watch these shows more. Because we've already brought you the analysis that children aren't interested in these sorts of really old shows. One, because of, like, the analysis brought to you from Russell, that they're archaic, they're shinier, fancier, newer ones that are more advertised. But also I'll tell you that children have two things going for them. First, they really like to repeat watch shows. I have, like, small children running around my house frequently. You will often see the exact same shows replayed over and over and over again, because that's just what they really kicked in their brains, because their minds are young and they just really enjoy that. We say that they probably wouldn't be reaching for these in most circumstances, given they'll imprint on something else first. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is that children like to watch things that other children are watching, which means that in order for somebody to actually want to watch Dumbo, first their, like, entire kindergarten class or the entire first or second year class has to be like, hey guys, we're all going to watch Dumbo together right now. We're all going to talk about Dumbo. And that's not really going to happen, though. In the comparative, what's going to happen is one cool kid goes to see Moana. It's like, Moana's really awesome at the theater. And then everybody else will pester their parents about going to watch Moana, which means that it's always more likely that the newest, hippest, cool thing is what children are likely to watch. They're not going to be seeking out Dumbo, whether or not it's shown anywhere, whether or not it's on Disney Plus, which means that the type of people who are watching Dumbo, who are, when they scroll through their Netflix feeds and clicking on these links, or when they're, like, choosing to tune in on the TV and trying to click through channels, are going to be adults with some sense of nostalgia. And we told you that these were the people who are most important in this debate, because obviously they were the ones who are most impacted by this debate, being the primary watchers, but also because these people watching these shows helped rectify a lot of their inherent assumptions about their levels of racism, because it highlights how you can, as a society, hide away a lot of racist or problematic beliefs that only become problematic once the light is shone on them in the clarity of cold future years. What we mean is that the child you who watched that and thought it was really funny and thought Dumbo was great only now realizes, when you are an adult and rewatching it, what sort of problematic beliefs were being fostered upon you, being foisted and told you. And this forces you to not only re-examine your own causes, right? Re-examine whether or not you in that instant might have been mistreating minorities badly, be like unintentionally or subconsciously, and perhaps trying to correct those behaviors, but also that it means that you as a individual are more aware of just how prevalent these things were. Because imagine how prevalent an attitude has to be in society before a family-friendly show such as Disney is willing to make it into part of their movie. These are the messages that then tell us of how problematic these issues are, which means that when you then see the Black Lives Matter movement protesting, you think, oh, right, yeah, the 70s when I watched Dumbo, or the 90s when I rewatched Dumbo and didn't think it was a problem, or like the 90s when I as a child because of watching Dumbo, whatever. Yeah, I watched these things, didn't think it was a problem. I should probably recheck that. I think that if this attitude was so massive, it would still have effects upon the current day. Therefore, I might support the Black Lives Matter movement more. But we also tell you that to the extent, like, like on children that, first of all, I already told you, they don't stumble upon themselves, but to the extent that these can be used by adults as part of guided supervision to try and teach children very basic concepts of what racism looks like, how prevalent racism was, and this is an opening like foot in the door in order to teach children about how people were and behaved in the past, we say that it's a beneficial tool you cut parents and teachers off from. You cut parents off from the ability to sit down with their child and maybe show them like, hey, this is something that I watched. And then like, you thought it was really cool, right? Because often what will happen is that like, again, we tell you that parents forget that these things are really racist. They take their child, they say, Dumbo is a really good movie, we're gonna watch it. And then they get to the scene with the racist crows. And then suddenly the parent has to make a difficult decision. They have to start being like, the child's gonna have to ask questions about like, why is there a warning up in front of this show? And then when they get to the crows, the parents have to explain what the crows meant, why it was bad, why it was something that needed to be fixed. First, teaching the child lessons about how they should behave, lessons about morality. But also we told you that teachers frequently use these movies and like use their streaming privileges of these movies to open the door and say, look, this used to be how everybody treated Black people. This is why it was problematic. Here are the lessons you learned, instead of literally having to show them pictures of slavery. And we say that that was a useful tool to teach children at a very foundational level why things were problematic. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their speech. To conclude the substantive of the affirmative bench, now calling the very honorable third affirmative speaker to begin whenever they're ready. Hear, hear.
Hi, can I just have a moment, please?
Yeah, sure thing. You can have to.
Sorry about that. Am I audible? Starting in 3, 2, 1. Negating team has an extremely weird case here today. They don't want kids to watch these shows. They do recognize that the shows can be racist and some people can recognize that racism. So they don't really want the widespread viewership of these shows. The only argument they make is no, widespread viewership in terms of kids won't happen anyways, so it's fine because we have these 1 or 2 benefits. I would posit, if negating team also agrees with us that children should not be watching these shows in the first place in a more widespread entertainment type context, if I take down their benefits for these shows, they have no reason but to agree with us, because surely at the point at which you ban them, you protect children better in our side of the house. What did negating team talk to you before I bring back my own positive material? They talked to you about 2 things, and I like to really point out there wasn't much material as to why you should allow these shows, rather just rebuttals and mitigation to us. 2 things they talked about. First, they talked to you about how adults can watch these shows and learn. And the impact of that was now they'll feel more sympathetic because they're like, oh, I was racist too. I'm going to mitigate this because I think it's really low impact than compared to it. The mitigation is simple. We already gave you reasons in second as to why adults simply don't watch these shows in the first place, i.e. there are better, more appropriate adult shows. There's just an embarrassment coming to watching an old show like Mickey Mouse or something of that sort, or Aladdin again. I certainly haven't watched it. I'm not too sure how many adults do. Really small impact there. But let's make it even smaller. The amount of adults that watch it, you have to necessarily be liberal. Really liberal, to the point at which you can recognize these implicit biases and be like, oh, this is so bad. I would posit most adults would just watch it and just have a really good time out of it, especially when you put it into the frame of nostalgia. These are shows that mattered a lot to them. These are shows they had positive memories and experiences with in particular, which is why it's really, really bad to put racist shit within entertainment and really well-made shows. The issue with this particularly is when adults watch these shows, even if they are liberal to some extent, they often can get influenced by their positive nostalgic biases and not recognize the racist overtones in themselves. So insofar as the vast majority of adults won't recognize it, I don't see why their benefit stands. So who would recognize it, right? Probably extremely liberal people who can point out such biases. People like you and us and hopefully all of us. I don't see the impact there because that's symmetrical, because all of us hopefully already support BLM, already support such movements, already donate to them, already feel sympathy for them, already recognize that everyone was racist to a certain point and we have a lots of room to grow, already are in interaction with people who are from these movements and are trying to actively improve ourselves. So I don't see the particular impact there. But I would posit simply, at the point of which you ban these shows, you have greater discourse around it. Because surely the question that everyone will be asking then is, why did Disney ban these shows? What was so wrong about them? What was so wrong about Dumbo? I don't remember anything particularly wrong. And at that point, which you create a vacuum where there's a demand for this question, media agencies, articles, blogs, the BLM movement do step in. They say, hey, this is why, I'm sure you're all wondering, you have TV shows and talk shows, this is why Disney banned these shows, this is what the BLM movement was saying, this is why they were so problematic, and we can show you experts, look at this Dumbo scene, this is why this was so bad. So adults even have the better mechanism on our side of the house to actually recognize, because this media narrative is going to be even stronger, because at the point of which you ban them, surely people question why the ban happened, more people who would have watched these old shows in the past. So surely then you have more adults realizing that these shows were bad, even if that's an impact we should care about. The second thing they talk to you about, and I think this first thing will be reasonably rebutted and compared because of that. The second thing they talk to you about is, oh no, you need academic context in teaching because you need to educate children. Now, the first distinction I make is a huge fucking distinction between, let's say, a racist movie and a movie that shows racism occurring, insofar as you can still show or movies that show how slaves were treated or show how some implicit racism or how some bullying towards a black kid was happening. There are lots of new shows, by the way, that do show that. That's fine. There's a huge difference between that and shows that themselves are comicalizing, are actually making fun of racist caricatures to begin with. So that's a huge distinction. You can still show the latter. But notice, you can still go to museums. Teachers can still have, let's say, documentaries of these shows and articles that they make their kids read, experts of it. I don't particularly see the issue. We all study, let's say, feminist or anti-women female ads back in the day. They read that they in our classrooms. That doesn't mean we allow these ads in the mainstream where they can actually get absorbed by the new children. So I don't think there's any positive reason shown to you by negating team as to why you should have these shows in the first place. What did we tell you and why haven't they rebutted this? I need answers for all of this from third leg, even though I think that's kind of late. Firstly, the principle that Vani, my first speaker, talked to you about, this takes them at their best and says, sure, if every criticism of yours is right and we have no practical benefit, then it is still wrong. Two reasons why this was morally wrong. Firstly, you did not have the choice of those people who you were showing in a negative manner, i.e. you never took the choice of the black people back in the day. You probably don't have the choice of these people right now either, especially because you can easily infer that they don't like it at the point of which they're saying bring down the statues. At the point of which this has become such a big question in itself, means that the BLM community has denounced such shows, means that there's such strong opposition from these communities for those. So you're violating the choice of the most oppressed people, and you're also continuing to make a lot of money off of these shows to begin with, i.e. rich old white people and Disney itself, who maliciously made these shows, is still continuing to benefit off not only the culture of black people, we even say benefit of the culture of another community, and oppressed community is bad, right? We don't allow arts and stuff like that to happen. It's definitely even worse when you're benefiting off making fun of that culture. This moral principle they've never contested with. I need an answer. But the second thing is, like, why do children actually get impacted? I think the first premise that they try to contest is that children don't watch these shows. I think that's BS. My second speaker gave you arguments, but notice these shows are readily available. They're available on Disney Plus, which lots of children now are accessing, right? At the point of which there's not lots of children's shows on Disney Plus, which is the reality right now, they will eventually, if I buy their own characterization, the children have a lot of time, watch lots of shows, eventually end up watching these shows as well because they finish the new shows. Shows just aren't being released as much in quarantine. So they will eventually watch older shows like Lion King, like Mowgli, like Jungle Book, all of that type of stuff. Notice also, they also watch these shows because parents often recommend them, because parents don't realize. Here in our world, even if parents don't realize, it's not a problem because parents can't recommend the shows in the first place because they don't exist to begin with. Because these have huge, let's say, cult personalities of the shows, because they're largely available, because parents and old family friends are saying, hey, have you watched the Jungle Book? I used to watch it back in my day. Children are likely to watch these shows to begin with. I think lots of children do watch it. It's just much safer to ban it. The impacts of this are that two things. The children from the majority group will internalize these stereotypes. They say this is not how it happens. Guys, how does socialization happen? Which is why if you show, let's say, young girls, let's say shows that show them in a subdued manner, in a housewife's position, they do grow up with certain patriarchal ideals, right? We all agree this is how socialization happens. These children are also likely to internalize it. These children are also likely to notice that this black caricature was being made fun of. So it's also okay to make fun of it. That this black character had something different with it, which is why there's often lots of bullying in like say playgrounds and stuff. As say, i.e., why are you black? Why do you have a nose different than ours? Oh, why are you so different? Why are you brown? Oh, Mowgli, Jungle Book, all sorts of these names are thrown across, and you give them more ammunition. But secondly, those children that belong from the minority group feel really bad, especially if their parents have already told them as to why, especially because they can see that someone similar to them is being made fun of in a comical way. But even the adults in the minority group, people like me with brown people like black people, shows see this as a sign that Disney, as the wider society, is still unwilling to take down these shows, even though we are asking them to do so, because they care more about educating the wide masses who we shouldn't give a shit about in the first place. So I think these are huge harms, and the developing country context still stands because Disney might not have a full control insofar as how these people show the shows, insofar as do they actually adhere to the, let's say, the disclaimer timelines in themselves. But Disney can simply ban them, right? This can simply stop selling rights to developing countries. They can't simply do all of that. I think a material hence all of this stands, and I still see no reason, no positive reason as to why you should continue these shows on Neck Bench. So proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their speech. To conclude the substantive of the negative bench, now calling the very honorable third negative speaker to begin whenever they're ready. Here, here.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Great. 1 second. Sorry. Panel, understand that the affirmative team wants to tell us that these shows are so subtly racist that people aren't able to call it out, and that adults will have a good time watching them without realizing that they're racist. To the extent that is true, they were not able to claim all of their harms related to these shows making kids racist. Because if the racism in a piece of media is so subtle that an educated adult can't call it out, then I fail to see why this racism would creep into the minds of our children and have all the toxic impacts that the affirmative team wanted to talk about. And when they failed to prove those harms, they failed to win this debate. So 3 main points in my speech today. Firstly, who is watching these shows? Secondly, will these shows actually make kids more racist? And thirdly, on the point of educational outcomes. So, first of all, who is watching these shows? They keep telling us that no adults enjoy watching Disney movies. I say that this is a blanket and unsubtle characterization. But even to the extent that adults don't watch Disney movies on their own, they do get out these movies to watch with their own kids. They get out movies from their childhood to enjoy with their children or their nieces and their nephews. Personally, this is something that I've definitely done. Further, we say that for an adult to appreciate that there is outdated racism in a piece of media and to understand a very simple warning label, they do not have to be very, very liberal as the affirmative team would like to claim. BLM is on our news pretty much every day. The average person is not particularly racist. Panel, you have to understand that neither side of this debate was able to fix racism in the Deep South. We were talking about white people who are moderates, white people who probably voted for Obama but didn't understand how they could also have internalized racist views as children. At the very least, we said a warning label made these people think about how they'd enjoyed these shows and think about the inherent values hidden in these shows. The affirmative team wanted to provide lots of other mechanisms, like protests, how we could help educate adults about racism. I say that this is not enough, because none of these mechanisms show the extent that innocent children used to be complicit in internalized racism. Panel. None of these mechanisms show adults that they can be complicit in racism. They might show us that racism is a bad thing, but they don't show us how racism is indoctrinated into us from an early age, and at that point, we were able to claim an educational benefit on our side of the house. So briefly responding to this point about developing countries. I'd like to note the affirmative team never actually explained why they were the most important stakeholder in this debate, especially when the major harm that they wanted to bring was the harm to minority kids, especially black kids who are getting bullied for their facial features. At the point where these kids probably didn't exist in countries like Pakistan, I fail to see why this was such a major stakeholder. But let's engage with the stakeholder for a second, just so I've shut it down. So we said that developing countries, people were still able to pirate movies. We said piracy was rife, from the pirated DVD industry in Bali to just like downloading illegal movies. This was just something people were able to do. What's the outcome of this? This means that the movies weren't as likely to be very popular in these countries as they wanted to claim. And also, we fail to see how banning these movies was actually going to benefit these communities, except for people haven't watched them yet. You know, I think that if the racism in these communities was so deeply entrenched as they wanted to claim, if people were so anti-black, then banning a few movies probably didn't have the impact that they needed to win them this debate. So on to my next point about, will watching these shows actually make children more racist? The issue here is that the affirmative team wanted to talk about bullying as a form of mental torture, and that the exaggeration of particular physical features in these shows made children more racist. So this assertion was contingent on two things. Firstly, the kids understanding the racist context, i.e. kids understanding what a minstrel show actually was, and on kids choosing to watch a majority of these shows rather than shows like Moana and Frozen. So why are these two contingent principles not actually likely to happen? Well, firstly, James told you that kids rewatch the same shows all the time, and that their media intake was not limited to the movies on Disney+. I think the affirmative team underestimated the number of movies on Disney+ anyway, but this doesn't particularly matter. We told you that that shows like Moana were much, much better marketed than anything old, and that they were much more likely to appeal to kids who are used to high quality CGI. But also, they said that they still won if they stopped a kid from watching one racist show and 10 progressive shows, and instead that kid watched 11 progressive shows or 10 progressive shows or whatever. But note, speaker, that point only flies if you buy none of our educational benefits, if you cannot accept that there is any value in showing these shows. I am about to prove to you why these shows actually have a very good educational value for children, and at that point, we say that maybe a kid watching one racist show is actually better in the context of them being surrounded by progressive media, which was much more likely to shape their worldview. So, on to my last point about educational outcomes. Speaker, let's do a quick comparative. They told us that they wanted to put these movies in museums, and they wanted signs explaining this carefully, the context around these shows and what happened in them and why they were bad. So yes, we concede that warning labels are short, and maybe they're not able to express the full context around something. But these labels can be made accessible to children, and they can be made short so that they don't necessarily impact someone's enjoyment of the media. Compare that to a museum. Museums tend to be concentrated in large metropolises. There are no museums in regional areas. Further, we tell you that middle-class people are actually much more likely to go to museums than working-class people, so it was likely only inner-city rich people and inner-city rich schools who went on trips to these museums in the first place. So compare that to the educational value of something being on a syllabus all over the country, even to the extent that Disney wasn't able to fully control how schools were showing these movies and how they were presented on the syllabus, we still said that that was a benefit. Because ultimately, when they brought out this museum mechanism, they were conceding to our benefits to the extent that they accepted that there was some educational value in watching these shows, to the extent that they didn't want to smother them and pretend that they never existed. They did want to show that these shows existed and that they were bad. We said that it was far better to have them across the country in the very capable hands of our teachers who are able to explain the racist context behind them. They told you there were other ways of teaching kids about racism, but we said we're talking about very small children in this scenario, children who probably aren't ready for a film about the Holocaust or to learn about Emmett Till, the young black boy who was lynched by white racists. We said that at the point where you could introduce children gently to racism and gently to how people's attitudes can be swayed by malignant media. That was a benefit under our side, which they conceded to through their museum mechanism. They also wanted to talk about how banning these shows would cause more discourse. But I would say that there was no mechanism behind how banning these shows was actually going to cause discourse. You shouldn't credit it very much as well because it was new material at third. But even when this discourse existed, it was likely to be long term. Whereas when something is on a school curriculum, it is on a school curriculum for a long time and it continues to shape the minds of our children into the future. Ultimately, we got more benefits for children, more benefits for adults. We encourage people to challenge their racist views. So proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their speech. To begin the reply portion of today's debate, now calling the very honorable negative reply to begin whenever they're ready. You're here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Negative conception was simple in this debate. Disney movies didn't cause racism, but they were a reflection of how racist society was. And that reflection caused a lot more impact within the minds of adults than it did in any way shape the minds of children. So, first understand how you should weight this debate, because the impact of leaving these shows up in Netflix, leaving these shows in circulation, would be most impactful upon who actually watched them. We told you that the people who actually watched them were the people who grew up with the shows and had an attachment to them, rather than the children who did not have an attachment to them and would want to watch things that we told you for a variety of reasons more appeal to them, such as the fact that it was shinier, newer, and what their friends were talking about. As such, the things which impact adults in this debate are therefore the most weighted. What we told you here is that adults were vastly impacted like this at the point in time when they realized that, oh, once upon a time, when I was a child, everything was a lot more racist than it is now. And I'm cringing at this picture of like a minstrel crow and trying to mock black people. And I'm cringing at this Siamese cat thing that like is a racist depiction of Asians. And I'm now thinking about how that means that maybe I should reconsider whether or not I should like continue to have some of these hidden associations of race, or maybe I should possibly reconsider not dismissing out of hand when the Black Lives Matter movement gets up and says racism has been a problem in the society. Because now we have very poignantly shown you how racism has been prevalent in your society, reflective to the point where even Disney, a family-friendly channel, was willing to show some of these views that forced you to grow up and forced you to suddenly reconsider a lot of the issues, which was a huge benefit. But their only real response was that apparently this thing was so subtle that you couldn't be able to tell. We told you that that was simply not true, but also told you that that was a contradiction to their majority of their case, which was that children would apparently watch these become more racist. Because as we said at Brittany, to the extent that this was true, that it was very subtle, then watching the crow stereotype wouldn't make a person more racist, because all it could do was reflect how society was racist. But to that extent, we then stepped out to you how a caricature of a minstrel show meant nothing to you if you didn't know what a minstrel show was, and a caricature of a crow doing a minstrel show just looked like a crow doing some odd actions that like were maybe or maybe not a bit funny, but you didn't associate the black crow with your black human because Dumbo never said that, and that Disney shows systematically did this sort of thing. So therefore, children watching these shows was fine, because all they saw was a bit of an archaic joke that didn't necessarily link to human beings and didn't necessarily cause the racism that they would like to say claim. To that end, we say that not like there's benefit, their harms don't exist. But also we say that if you believe that they would use these characteristics to bully other children, we said that that only applied if they were going to bully those kids anyways. That in that case, they were going to bully them regardless of whether you gave them an easy example to a monkey. They would have found some other example if Disney did not provide one. We say that their harms are minimal. Then they want to talk about developing nations. But again, to the extent that their analysis relies on that the people in developing nations aren't as progressive as people in the West and wouldn't cringe in the same ways, we told you that therefore, like, it didn't really matter in this debate whether there was this thing or not, because they would be racist anyways if that's what they wanted to believe. But also, we told you the developing nations couldn't be weighed up to the extent of like the Western nations in this debate, to the extent that if Disney couldn't control distribution within them, then obviously they could no longer stop circulation as much as they could slap warning labels. To that end, we would vastly encourage you to consider negative.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their speech. To finally conclude this debate, now calling on the very honorable affirmative reply to begin whenever they're ready.
The messaging in these films is so subtle that kids will not recognize it as racist and therefore won't do racist stuff, is what the rebuttal from side negative has been in this debate. Like, guys, come on. Like, if you don't know something is racist, you internalize it. That doesn't mean that you don't act out in the same manner, because you presumably thought that it's fine. 3 things in this speech, 4 things actually. 1, do kids watch these shows? 2, do kids get affected by this? 3, adults. And 4, principle, which they don't respond to. Okay, let's just start with do kids watch these shows? Like, I think they've given you 2 sorts of incentives for why kids don't, right? They tell you that kids watch new shows, the ones that are advertised, and they oftentimes like rewatch shows. Like, insofar as these incentives exist, they don't rebut the incentives on our side. So what are the incentives that we gave you? I think the first thing is parental authority doesn't doesn't work completely always. So parents don't control what these kids watch and what they don't. So it's incredibly likely that they can. But 2, parental authority also means that if the parent wants to like talk about Mickey Mouse or all of these other shows that they saw in childhood, or if the grandparents want to talk about it, given that they are authority figures, kids oftentimes listen to them and watch these kinds of shows. The third mechanism is something that they have provided, which is kids watch lots of these shows. They have lots of time. So they will at some point wander to some like a point of the internet and just find this. The third thing I want to talk about is like, again, like if you're watching these sorts of shows in school where your teacher is showing you under their model, then presumably you're watching it as well. The last thing I want to talk about is developing countries, because even if all of this doesn't matter in your world, I told you why in developing countries you don't get progressive shows, because they're much more expensive, they're newer, they require millions of dollars for you to get their rights as a local distributor, which is why these sorts of shows are shown. Like, insofar as that is true, like I think all of these sorts of impacts mean that kids are given access to these shows and there are incentives on either side for them to watch them. Like, I think insofar as these incentives exist, you must accept that there is a sizable chunk of kids, even if not all kids watch them, there's a sizable chunk of kids who do get access to this sort of stuff. Their argument about why this doesn't apply to developing countries, by the way, which is, oh, you're saying Disney doesn't control distribution, is false, because it's strawmanning the argument. We're saying Disney sells rights. After it sells rights, it really doesn't control how these sorts of shows are portrayed to kids. Okay, the second thing, do kids get affected by this? And I think this is the star-spangled awesome stuff that comes from like side negative, which is kids don't learn anything from shows. Media is not like a socialization industry at all, because, you know, it's so subtle that kids don't get it. Like, I think Essen also rebuts this, they don't just respond to it, which is kids are impressionable. Vani starts off with this in his speech. Kids are impressionable, subliminal messaging matters, both explicit and implicit. That's in Vani's speech. Look at your notes, right? Kids understand how to interact with other people. They normalize such behavior. This was used to dehumanize the others, like otherized communities. That is why all of these sorts of impacts exist. So this debate is not about like only the deep South and already racist communities, but actually kids who don't have a moral framework to judge the world by, because they're like literally kids, and they who don't know what right is and what wrong is, they can be impressioned by this. And we would err on the side of caution and remove these sorts of films from accessing them, because we don't want bullying in the world, even if they learn in the long run about why this is wrong and why this isn't. Like, I would much rather live in a world where this doesn't exist. Now the second thing, which is they say adults watch this. I think they don't respond to any of this material that we give you for why adults don't watch it. Like, they just say that they watch it because of nostalgia or because of nieces. Like, 1, limited time, you have to do work or university. 2, embarrassment. I gave you this in my speech. 3, other shows, which are adult shows, which is why adults oftentimes watch Netflix as opposed to Disney fucking Plus. And lastly, Essen also told you that even if they do, like, BLM can tell them that, you know, guys, this is a racist show. You need to watch the show to be like educated about the fact that it is racist. I'm not sure why this is a crucial mechanism for adults to change their mind, especially because I told you that you can watch the news, all of those sorts of things. So I'm just not sure. And they don't respond to any of the rebuttals that Essen gives to this in his third and call it like new material. But clearly it's rebuttal. The last thing I want to talk about is the principle, because even if adults have every sort of benefit that they talk about, kids are not affected at all. One, black people never gave consent to this. We know because black people are against statues. They want them to be removed, perhaps be placed in museums. And two, Disney has historically this is clearly racist content, not content that seeks to educate, but content that seeks to make fun of you just because of the color of your skin. Very proud of course.
I'd like to thank everybody for their speeches. Let's now virtually cross